my thing consistently for 20 years or something has been in tight orbit around psychedelics and the psychedelic experience, with special emphasis on experience. That it's not a philosophy, it's not a revelation, it's not a lineage, it's not a teaching, it's an experience. And how you obtain it is quite simple. You know, you ingest a plant or a substance. It's not about dietary prohibitions, celibacy, obedience, constancy, moral worth. None of these things enter into it. It was this very simple method. And the reason I was so keen for it was because when I was growing up and in my youth, I was very interested in the idea of the paranormal, of the miraculous. And I remember one of the early things I read was Rockcliffe's 19th century study, Extraordinary Illusions and Delusions of the Supernatural and the Occult, which lists, ectoplasm, crowd hysteria, mesmerism, Ouija boards, all these things are discussed in their turn. But my fascination was with the weird and the fringy and even the occult and the frankly magical and the heretical. But my method was always scientific. It was never to believe these things unquestioningly. It was always to take A.E. Waite's Book of Ceremonial Magic and, collect rosemary and steal the proper instruments from the village rectory and, save the host and then attempt the conjuration. And then if it failed, put a check mark after medieval ceremonial magic, does not compute, and move on. So I grew up in a small town in a very isolated situation, and nothing about this seemed strange to me. This method of approaching the occult, and I read J.D. Rhine, and that was all about statistically gathering data and so forth and so on. Well, somewhere along the line, and some people, interestingly, have suggested, both to me personally and then I've seen it in print, that these very substances and plants that I'm so keen for have somehow had on the mass mind the effect of generally softening heads, so that epistemological rigor has broken down and rules of evidence have been compromised, and now every half-baked intuition can come flooding through, and as long as it has its coterie of bleating adherents, it will take its place, in the great yellow pages of American Revelation as part of the spiritual smorgasbord. Well, I abhor this argument, because the whole point with psychedelics was to cut through the programming and the cant and the propaganda of culture to true truth, real reality, not to just initiate an era of intellectual permissiveness where everything in the spiritual marketplace was placed on the same pedestal as Euclidean geometry. And in a way, this is what has happened. So I'm interested to understand what went wrong, and, I don't know if anything can be fixed anymore, but it can be fixed in my own mind if I understand it. It began this devolution of the discursive environment with a healthy skepticism of science. There had been too much science, And science had thrown out too many babies with the bathwater. I'm talking approximately the time of the birth of the human potential movement and the coming on of LSD and all that. What was happening in science at the same time was people were building atom bombs, or they were propounding behavioral psychology, ratomorphic theories of behavior. It was a great era of the triumph of reductionism and so forth. And so a whole lot of people wrote deconstructive books and essays about science and trying to link it back to the spiritual, and successfully, in my opinion. Probably the most dramatic of these books was Thomas Kuhn's book. Probably most of you have read it, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he offers the, for the time, startling proposal, and then proves it, that modern science is actually based on very woo-woo revelations, spiritual encounters with aliens, people who had visionary dreams and so forth, and that the story science likes to tell about how it does its work, which is you take your colleagues' earlier work, you carefully check the facts, you perform experiments, you advance the theory by incrementally advancing hypotheses, which you carefully test, and that's the story you tell once you have the beast dead in the boat. But the real experience of dragging one of these things out of the water is much more dramatic and hair-raising and chance-taking. And for instance, we know now that Gregor Mendel, when he did his experiments with sweet peas, that if he had actually been rigorous in his observations, he would have missed the laws of genetic segregation. The sweet pea doesn't quite perform in the theoretical way that Mendel's notebooks seem to show. What he did was he rounded up and rounded down because he already had an intuition that the recessive gene would have a certain mathematical characteristic. So he played with the data to make the theory right. Well, then it turned out it was right. But rarely can you play this game and get away with it the way he did. So as acid came on in the late 50s and early 60s, and as science reached its most reductionist and obnoxious crescendo, there was this healthy skepticism of science. It had gone too far. You know, it was producing atom bombs, but not giving us a social psychology or a theory of psychoanalysis or anything like that that we could really use. That seemed to be coming from the underground. What was wrong with science? Well, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but just as an aside, if you're interested in it, I think it had become too dependent on probability theory, on statistical analysis, on certain assumptions in the way it did its mathematical bookkeeping were not apparent to the second and third generation of scientists working in this manner. So when I'm confronted with a historical phenomenon that seems like it's gone off the tracks or gotten into the ditch, my method is to go back through its history to try and find the last sane moment that it knew, and then make judgments based on that. Well, I think if you analyze science in that way, the basic idea of science, before the rise of probability theory, is science is the idea that human beings can understand nature, not relate to it, not ritualize it, not worship it, but intellectually encompass it somehow through modeling. And when you try to do this, a rule that quickly forces its limitations upon you is and that's very basic to the Western mind, is this thing formulated as Occam's razor. William of Ockham was a 14th century philosopher who founded a point of view called nominalism. But the thing that Occam said that is germane for this argument is, he said it in Latin, and there's different arguments about exactly what he said, but here's the boil down. What he said was, hypotheses should not be multiplied without necessity. Or, to further boil it down, keep it simple, stupid. Or, halfway between these 2 points, in all situations, the simplest adequate explanation should be preferred. So see what this is? It's also sometimes called the principle of parsimony. Parsimony being the simplest and most elegant way of doing something. So it's the principle of parsimony, that the simplest adequate explanation should always be preferred. This is a great idea. I don't think you will get into trouble with this idea. And to sort of close the loop generated by Jim's question, this is where the reaction to science has gone wrong. The principle of parsimony is now no longer now intuitively grasped by other people. In other words, when you sit down at the table in the dining room to talk about the universe with people, you cannot be sure that if you mentioned this idea, whether you called it Occam's razor, the principle of parsimony, or you just explained what it meant, you can't be sure that it would have any intellectual force with people. Somehow people have moved into a Baroque or even Rococo phase in their model building, and they have no problem adding on incredibly improbable and illogical bells, whistles, curlicues, filigrees, fleur-de-lis, paisleys, and what have you, to their thinking. And it's a problem. It's a problem for everybody in society. What puzzles me is, it offends me that psychedelic people are susceptible to this, because it seems to me we're the last people who should be susceptible to this. We have no need of spiritual illusions because we have access to spiritual realities through the substances and the plants. So why should we, least of all, why should we buy in to all these unanchored, woolly, fluff-headed ideas that are being pushed in the spiritual marketplace? The only answer I've been able to come up with is simple proximity. That by the rest of society, we have been lumped in with these people, and they move freely among us, easily detected, but rarely ostracized. Our own tolerance has become our weakness. And it's this weird political correctness where people do not say, what you just said is preposterous. It makes no sense whatsoever. This is just thought so ungenerous of spirit to point out that someone makes no sense at all. It's that their feelings, I think, have become preeminent in the value system. It's more important not to hurt someone's feelings than to let them walk around with a head full of crap. So, having identified this as a problem, and having never been terribly sensitive to other people's feelings anyway, I was a good person to send to the ramp. But the consequences of this are not good. In other words, if we really want to build a sane and caring world, we can't do it based on illusion, unanchored thinking, and just plain silliness. It's very hard. The world is in the hands of very hard-eyed and practical people. They have learned that by owning the planet you can make money. They're not going to easily step away from the wheel. They are going to have to be presented with an overwhelming argument or circumstance for them to go quietly into retirement. And by vitiating the thrust of critical thinking with this cult of generalized political correctness, we weaken our case for a new way of running the world. In fact, our entire political phenomenon becomes a case against the relinquishing of power by the old order. So, I've tried to put this in a very general form without naming names or goring anybody's particular ox, because I don't think it's a good idea to then move on to the Inquisition and drag each practitioner forward and, with fire and lance separate the dross from the gold. But in a sense, I think this needs to be done internally. And it's a strange thing. It's very complicated. Part of the problem, and we've talked about this in the past, is that the media is a system for amplifying the trivial and the absurd. In other words, man goes to work, does superb job, returns home. This is no headline. No one is interested in this. But Alien Mom 9 gives birth to dead Christ. Now, this is extraordinary and resonates in many people's minds. And, if there were corroborative evidence, it would move around the planet as a hysteria within hours. As intellectuals, by intellectuals I mean people who can read, as intellectuals, we are guiltier than most people in participating in tolerating this kind of a system, because it literally is a system of bread and circuses. Energy follows attention. Therefore, if attention's focus can be trivialized, those who work in the background of social consciousness are completely unobserved. And what can be done about the media? Why does the media behave this way, and what can be done about it? Well, the media amplifies trivia because trivia sells. And ultimately, it's hard not to reason back to one's own guilt. Ultimately, it is the childishness and self-indulgence and muddle-headedness of each one of us that allows this entire system to come into existence. This system of commodity fetishization, objectification of social value, the marketplace of ideas, the idea that everything can be put into an economic model and value, and then our appetite for pop culture, which is essentially an arena of propagandization, brainwashing, and brand consciousness establishing.